Welcome to our next Starship Writer story titled, Poison Ground. Left alone, the rainforest will quickly take back what has been taken from it. Nature will obliterate the marks of human hands beneath vine and creeper, unless the legacy has poisoned the soil beyond redemption. Then the wound may not heal. Year may pass upon year. Lifetimes may come and go before the evil is purged from the ground, or until by fate, someone happens onto the scene, a person who unknowingly can cleanse the ground, or unwillingly be corrupted with it. We at Starship Writer hope you enjoy Poison Ground Part 1 An Evil Refuge.
Poisoned Ground, Part 1. An Evil Refuge.
The worn wipers thrashed across the windshield, each sweep throwing a spray of water to one side or the other of the old green Land Rover, while barely making any difference to the torrent of rain that cascaded down the flat glass. The 6 young occupants were silent and moody. Listening to the radio, crackling with static, didn't improve that mood. Category 5. Hurricane Yasi is expected to cross onto coastal areas within the next few hours. Are advised to take cover and make final preparations. We will bring you the next hurricane advise immediately it is issued. The announcer's voice died away as Kathy turned the volume down. I told you we should have left as soon as the warning started, she said angrily. Don't blame me if we get caught out in the open when it comes. Paul gripped the steering wheel tightly. He refused to even look at her as she continued with her briefly interrupted criticism. It's not his fault, Max interrupted, leaning forward, defending his friend from the rear bench seat. We couldn't have left any sooner, not without abandoning all the gear. And what would happen next semester if we turned up at uni without their equipment? I don't give a damn about their equipment, Kathy snapped back, now honing her attention to him. Diane sat quietly listening to them, and to the others. They had all become more hostile as the rain had become heavier. She was as worried as anybody, but fighting between themselves wouldn't help. Maybe we should stop somewhere and ask if we can take shelter, she said nervously. Don't talk stupid, snapped Jason cruelly from the front. He waved the folded map in his right hand. Like where? We're kilometers from anywhere. You mean you actually know where we are? Interjected Kathy. I hope one of you does, because I can't see a damn thing, muttered Paul, craning his head forward, squinting out to where the dim headlights clawed between the arched trunks, crowding the track from either side. Diane spoke again, her voice excited. There it is again. What? Said Paul. I saw a light again. For a moment they were all quiet as their eyes strained to see. Up ahead, over there, she pointed off to their left. What did you see? Said Max belatedly. The bespectacled youth trying to look in the direction she indicated. Rubbish, you can't have. We're at least 10 kilometers from the nearest road, grumbled Jason as if he actually knew. I tell you I saw one, flickering through the trees over there. She pointed into the bush, closer now. There must be a house. Even Paul glanced quickly, taking his tired eyes momentarily from the rutted mud, straining his vision into the almost impenetrable darkness. There's nothing there, said Max in disappointment. It's just your imagination, added Kathy. I'm sure But they had already returned to their mickery. Are you sure we're on the right track, Jason? I don't remember coming this way before, started Max. Jason's angry face was highlighted from the faint glow of the instrument panel. We came out in daylight, with no rain, he replied, drawling the words out in a sarcastic tone. Everything looks different in the rain, and it looks different at night. Is that too hard to understand? I saw it again, cried Diane, interrupting him. There, through the trees. Oh, for God's sake, where? Grumbled Joanne from beside her. I can't see anything. Is it a house? Said Max. It can't be a house. This is National Park. Nobody lives in a national park. Maybe it's the ranger, said Kathy hopefully. For once and for all, started Jason. There's no... He stopped in disbelief as the headlights picked up a break in the trees. There's a driveway. Paul was already slowing. They were almost up to it when he accelerated and drove past. Where are you going? Aren't you going to stop? Shouted Kathy, looking back out of the rear window as the track disappeared into the darkness behind them. If there are houses around here, we must be closer to the road than director we thought, Paul said as he drove on, ignoring her. Nice map reading, Jason, Joanne muttered. Barely a kilometer further along, they came to the creek. They pulled up at the top of a low bank. Nobody needed telling it was in flood, carrying trees and branches on a one-way trip to the Mulgrave River and on to the Coral Sea. They watched in silence until Max spoke. It looks deep. Paul pushed the metal handle down and forward. I better check before we try to cross. His voice sounded as if he wanted someone else to say they would do it, but no one did. Give me a hand, Max. You're joking. Go out there. What are you going to do? Said Joanne nervously. Find out how deep it is. Paul's voice was nearly drowned by the noise of rain that was now spraying through the top of his part-open door. Don't be crazy, Paul. You can't wade out into that. Called Diane after him as he pushed the door open. I'll be all right, he said, jumping down into the soft mud beside the vehicle, slamming the door behind him. Max, and let him, she pleaded with the second youth, as reluctantly he pushed forward his own door handle. He knows what he's doing. His voice failed to carry the certainty he tried to show. It's too deep, he'll be dragged away, she pleaded anxiously. No, he won't. Max shouted back over the noise of rain battering the aluminum roof, before his doors slammed shut too. Paul pulled the collar of his jacket up, high around his neck, trying to deflect the water that was already running down the inside of his shirt. He bent to unscrew the dirt-splattered shackle from under the front crossbar, and unlock the winch. Watch the end, he shouted to Max. Don't let it run out. It's not secured. Paul began unwinding the rope from the rust-stained drum. Thinking with every second that it wasn't a smart thing to do, he wound the rope around his wrist. Max watched Paul run a few steps to the bank. He felt miserable standing in the rain, but felt no desire to change places. Paul stared into the water, soaked to the skin, even though wearing a supposedly waterproof jacket. It looked cold. He was scared. This really was a bad idea. They had to get across, but doubt was smothering him. He glanced back at the vehicle as his courage evaporated away, hoping anyone would give him an excuse not to step forward. The light was on inside. Behind the sweep of the wipers, through the steam of spray rising off the hood, Paul could see their faces watching him. He was too late to change his mind, now pinned in the yellow headlights. He was like a character on stage, in front of an anticipating audience. He turned away and looked down. Turbulent waters seemed to make it even more ominous than before. The surface was about half a meter down the slope. It was impossible to guess how much deeper it became out towards the middle. He tried desperately to recall their outward trip. But then this, like the dozen others they had crossed, had been a dry. And in their excitement, it had passed as an almost unnoticed depression. Paul looped some more rope around his wrist. He drew out the action. His brain was telling him no, and his pride, yes. In an instant, he made his decision and threw his foot forward, stepping over the bank onto the soft slope. Immediately, that his patterned, sole-touched ground, the clay sheared, and he began sliding sideways. Max could hardly make out more than a vague shape through the layer of water that distorted the lenses of his glasses. He thought Jason was looking at him. He wondered if he wanted him to do something. Max couldn't see or understand what it was. He loosened his hold on the rope for a moment, pulling the wet spectacles from the bridge of his nose. It was pointless trying to keep them clean. He went to put them in his pocket. A searing hot pain erupted across his palm as the wet rope suddenly, wildly ran over his wrist. Taken by surprise, he let his spectacles fly from his fingers, dropping them down into the deep mud at his feet. The loose drum hummed as it spun, and the rope rapidly unwound. Max looked in horror as the first layer wound off, and the second began its peel away across the drum. He grabbed for the rope, again trapping it inside his palm. The heat and pain were incredible. It stung and burnt his flesh. Over half of the cable had fed out by the time his smarting fingers grabbed at the mud-smeared top crash rail. Holding on to the wet metal, he lifted his foot from the clinging clay to jam the rope between the sole of his shoe and the steel guide. Chunks of mud spun away from under his foot as the last layer of rope wound off the drum towards him, showering gritty red flakes of corrosion onto his wet legs. Max stamped down harder. With barely any turns left, at last it stopped and was trapped. His hand painfully regained its hold. "Jason," he shouted towards the cab. "Jason, I need you." He called while trying to see through myopic eyes where Paul had gone. Jason had watched in horror as the youth had been swept away and was already getting out of the vehicle as Max uttered the desperate cry. He eased the drag that threatened to tear the rope again from the fear-stricken boy. "Where's Paul?" he said uselessly. I don't know. One moment he was there, then..." They looked over into the torrent. There was no sign of the youth, only the thin length of rope running taut away from them, disappearing below the water's muddy surface downstream. Paul fell back, trying to clutch a hold onto solid ground, but his grasping hands found only wet soil that oozed through his fingers. "Max," he screamed in fear, feeling the lifeline loose. Already he was careering uncontrollably down the grade. Then he was thigh deep in the cold water. He spun back, his eyes skimming over the ground. Max wasn't looking at him. Framed in the headlights, he seemed unaware of what was happening. He shouted desperately into the pouring rain. Then he felt the ground under his feet give and his chest locked as the frigid water swirled up past his waist. The chilled, crushing weights of the stream penetrated through his clothes and lifted him. He never felt the bottom. The current, tipping him backwards, dunking him completely under the surface, swept up off his feet. Several seconds later, he struggled in shock and terror back to the surface, gasping for air and splashing wildly with his hands. In the fading light from the high beams, he saw trees sweep by him as the swollen river carried him away into the darkness. He was still on the surface, supported by his air-filled jacket. He reached and grabbed for any unseen branch as darkness swallowed him. The deafening sound of bubbles alternated with the roar of the water as he felt the red veil of blind terror envelop him. Then it was gone, and he could hear a voice. She was singing. There was a rabbit, something about a rabbit. Paul felt her close. She was talking to him, calm, soothing words. "No, not now. Go back. Quickly. Go back." For what seemed an eternity, he spun on the end of the line. He was too tired. The saturated clothing was too great a drag. His ears filled with the deafening noise of bubbles. Then, as he went under, he faced into the opaquely lit wash that formed around his face. For a moment he could hear Max shouting, the youth's voice carried to him on the wind, but the noise of water rushing by his ears made it impossible to hear what he had said. Paul shook his face, scattering the water from his eyes, briefly seeing Jason beside Max, before he rolled and submersed again. His lungs were bursting when once more the water partially drained from his face. He threw his head high, gasping for air, seeing the two boys desperately working arm over arm, reeling in the rope. Disoriented, Paul had no idea if he was moving or not, whether they appeared closer or further from him. Then he felt his knees bump into the creek bank. Moments later, hands gripped him, dragging him up and over the bank. He lay on his chest, choking, his face half in the soft mud. Jason roughly took his arms, pulling them back uncomfortably over his head. Paul wanted to shout that he was all right, but a throat full of water spewed from his mouth instead. "Stop! Stop!" he cried weakly, but loud enough for them to hear. They rolled him over, sat him up, blinding his eyes in the headlights' beams. "We thought you were a goner," panted Max, his body beginning to shake with delayed shock. In the truck, Kathy was shouting at Diane. "Shut the door! Shut the door!" She screamed at the confused girl, poised half out of the vehicle. "Paul, he needs... Shut the door!" Kathy screamed again, sliding to the far side of the seat.
"He's all right. Max and Jason can look after him. Shut the door."
Meekly Diane complied, pulling her drenched jeans back inside. The boys helped Paul to his feet. "I guess this means we don't cross over," joked Jason, trying to lighten the mood. "You'd better drive." Jason nodded, briefly looking up from winding the loose rope over the bull bar. Paul slumped on the bench seat. Kathy scrambled over the hard leather backrest without a second's delay. Paul slid into the middle as Max reappeared brandishing a cake of mud that contained his glasses. Jason half turned towards the others. "It's too risky to try and cross. We'll have to go back to sit the storm out." "What about that track?" offered Diane. "Can't be any more exposed than back at the campsite," said Max. "No. Well, we don't have much choice. We can't cross, and we can't stay here. We know there's no shelter back at camp, and we don't want to be caught out in the open," added Paul. Jason nodded. "Then the only place left where we might find somewhere is going to be down that drive we passed. Can't we just park the car?" "We're surrounded by trees, Joanne. The hurricane could bring any or all of them down on us," said Max acidly. "Well, don't get too confident. That could still happen," said Jason. "And until we go and have a look, we won't know if there's anything there we can shelter in or not." He clunked the gears into reverse. "Max changed places," said Paul softly. "I'll watch back out of the window as we go back." "I can still see," Max protested. "No, you can't. Stop pissing about. You're as blind as a bat without your specs. You'll have us in the bush." Paul twisted himself around so that Max could slide over to the middle. "Are you sure you're all right?" insisted Joanne, leaning over the seat, barely hidden concern in her voice. He gave her a weak smile. "Just don't ask me do that ever. Ever again." He leaned his head partly out of the window as Jason began to reverse back along the track. Max sat between them, still unsuccessfully trying to dry his spectacles on a damp oil rag. It was 10 or more minutes later that they reversed back past the break in the trees. Jason, thankfully, pulled his head back in, twisting his neck from side to side to ease the stiffness. A towel was flung over him from the back. With one hand, he massaged his scalp, leaving his hair a matted mess. He clunked the gears into forward drive and turned the car up the narrow roadway. Under the overhanging canopy, it felt as if they were in a tunnel and driven onwards with no greater choice than the water that ran in torrents across the track. Diane was leaning over from the back, a brush in her hand, attempting to smooth Jason's tangled locks. He looked to the limit of the lights.
"It doesn't look like anybody's driven down here for a long time."
"Where the heck does it go?" said Paul, not expecting an answer. "I don't know," muttered Jason. "But I've got a bad feeling." "Why? What have you seen?" Joanne seemed anxious. "Nothing. I'm just not sure we're going to have enough traction to get out. If we don't find somewhere we can turn around at the end, we really could end up being here until the dry season." "Don't worry about that far ahead," said Paul. "We have to get shelter before the hurricane hits. Once the rain stops, we can always trek back. Just hope there's something up ahead." "And if there isn't, it was your idea, Jason," muttered Kathy. "I know." Jason snapped, "It's my decision and..." Almost as he spoke the words, the trees thinned and disappeared off to their sides as they came into a clearing. Before them, emerging from the darkness at the very edge of the arcs of their headlights, was a timber house. The relief they felt at seeing the structure was brief. "Shit," muttered Max. "It's an abandoned homestead. Obviously it's gonna look abandoned," chided Jason. They came to a halt close to a dilapidated picket fence, bearing the way between them and the old building, the headlights lighting it starkly against the blackness behind. Diane shivered. From what they could see through the misted windscreen, the building was relatively undamaged. The roof appeared mostly intact, still deflecting the torrential rain in a watery curtain straight down past the edge of the veranda. The veranda itself was bordered by a post and rail fence, or what had once been one. Now there were nearly as many posts missing as still stood. Behind, the overlapping timber boards looked gray and cracked. A few of the deck timbers were curled up at the edges, and to complete the dismal picture, a gate with its ancient flaking white paint stood half open, uninvitingly, before them. "Oh my God," breathed Diane. "The windows don't look broken," said Jason, swallowing involuntarily. "What's there?" muttered Max, the lenses of his spectacles still too smeared to see properly through. "It's where they filmed Friday the 13th, Jason slowly replied to him. But nobody laughed, nor did anyone want to make the first move. They sat there, watching the building behind the regular swipe of the wipers, as if waiting for someone or something to appear. At last Paul spoke. "Look, it's just an old building. Anywhere that has been abandoned for a long time is going to look a bit scary. That light. Maybe there's somewhere else further down the track," said Diane, almost pleadingly. "Maybe there is. Maybe there isn't. What we do know is that we could get stuck further down. We need cover soon, and considering it's probably seen a good few hurricanes and still standing, this is as good as shelter as it gets. Then we must have passed another house," said Diane, unwilling to give up the possibility. "What you saw, Diane," said Kathy firmly, "was probably a flash of lightning through the trees. It wasn't Kathy. I'm sure I saw something back there that brought us here." "It was probably the headlights reflecting of some water or something. Or lightning, like Kathy said," agreed Max. "Or you imagined it," said Kathy sarcastically. She went to protest, but Jason put his hand up to her. "Look, everybody. Whatever Diane saw, the rain isn't going to let up. And if that hurricane really is that close, we really need to get under some shelter. Somewhere other than in the car. Get some lights on and some food cooking, and we'll all feel a lot different. Then what are we waiting for? Zombies to appear," said Max, treating the mood as a joke. He still held his glasses, and unable to grasp the atmosphere of the sight. "I still feel safer in the car," whispered Diane. But no one heard her. Paul had opened his door, and without a second thought he was running for the gate. He barged through, swinging it violently back against its hinges. The top one snapped off, leaving the gate leaning at a crazy angle away from the fence. By the time Diane looked up from it, Paul, flashlight in hand, was looking through the window into the building. There were brief flashes of reflected light, and then he was beckoning them to him, his eyes shaded against the headlights. First Max, then the others were opening their doors and running down the narrow gravel path to the front of the building. They all halted under the veranda, waiting grouped together, only Jason and Diane remaining in the vehicle. The slab door opened easily, and Max stood alone in the entrance, his distorted silhouette spreading over the floor inside a rectangular pool of light cast from the Land Rover's high beams. A damp, musty smell came to their noses. He stood back as Paul came to his side with a flashlight, scanning the interior with a brilliant beam. "Keep your eyes open. There's probably a whole menagerie of snakes in here," said Paul, going back over the walls again, slower this time. We'll need more light than this. Max, go back to the car and bring the gas lantern. Are we staying here? The youth asked, belatedly feeling the foreboding. Of course, Paul gave an impatient sigh. Come on, Max. It's an old abandoned house. What do you think is going to happen? Nothing. I don't like the darkness. It's, for heaven's sake, Max, then go and get the gas lantern and bring some food, insisted Paul. Max hesitantly spoke to the girls. Come and give me a hand to bring in the chili bin. Jason and Diane are still. Started Kathy, but stopped. She reluctantly went back with them out into the rain. Paul waited in the doorway, carefully examining the rafters and dark corners with the flashlight. Kathy was opening the rear passenger door. Are you two going to help, or sit and watch? Attempting to lean inside from the rain. Reluctantly, Diane and Jason joined the others, carrying sleeping bags and what food and utensils they could hold into the house. Paul had already stepped through the door and was stood in the center of the room. He was calling over his shoulder as he heard them back on the veranda. I haven't checked everything out yet. With Max following closely behind, he went into an adjoining room. Without the flashlight, the main room was only dimly lit. They turned as Jason walked in, carrying the silver-painted gas tank, with the unwilling Diane following him. He strode towards the slab timber kitchen table and screwed the tall, rigid pipe holding the lantern onto the tank and twisted open the valve. The smell of sulfur pervaded the air as he struck a match. With a hiss of escaping gas and an ear-popping whoomph, the mantle burst into flame, bathing the room in its bright white light. That's better, called Max from the other side of the timber wall. They all visibly eased. The room seemed a little less threatening now that they had banished the shadows. They could see that the house was still furnished, although in a very basic sort of way. A table and several chairs, two upholstered in a faded pattern material, faced the black iron stove. There was little else. Pans and crockery sat on shelves near the sink. There's no water on the floor. The roof must be tight, observed Max. The words prompted Kathy to walk over to the deep concrete sink and turn on the single large brass tap. A stream of viscous brown liquid poured out. Yuck, drawled, turning it off. Let it run, called Paul, coming back into the room. The pipes are probably rusty. It may clear itself. As she watched, the color slowly disappeared, leaving a clear stream. Well, at least there's water in the taps, said Diane, adding without thinking, the tank must be full. It's torrential rain outside, Diane. What do you expect? Said Kathy in her usual sarcastic manner. Diane dropped her gaze to the floor, avoiding the other's eyes. She began to despair of saying anything. Whatever she said made her look more of a fool. Terrific. A fire, said Jason, drawing attention from her. He was walking over to a small potbelly stove stood near the central wall that divided the bedroom from the living area. Alongside the squat black drum stood a scuttle full of cut logs that he reached down to the pile. I'm freezing in these wet clothes, we need a big fire. Joanne came up alongside him and peered up to the roof. Do you think it's safe? Safe. What could be wrong? He had already begun stuffing pieces of timber through the small front grill. I don't know. I just read somewhere about fumes from these things. Geez. I don't know about all you lot. It isn't as if we can go to the management and ask for another room. She turned away. What is all damp? He said, not noticing. I hope it'll still burn. He realized there was no kindling. Maxer turned to run out to the car. Again. I've just been. He protested. Do you want to get dry? What about you or Paul? Jason shrugged. I was the Boy Scout. I've got to get the fire prepared. Paul, Max shouted. If the other youth heard, he didn't reply. Max realized he would have to go. What do you want? He snapped. We need to start a fire. Fire lighters. Max begrudgingly reached for the door latch. "Oh, Max, while you're there, bring the radio," added Kathy. "And another saucepan, and 2 more plates and cups," added Joanne. Hang on. Hang on. I've only 1 pair of hands." Diane saw he was losing his temper. "I'll come and help," she said, walking to the door. "It's okay." He grunted begrudgingly. "Here, look after these." Diane saw he had some small nuts in his hand. She looked at him curiously. "I think they're peanuts." There's a plant to the side of the path. Then he was gone, leaving her smiling. When Max returned to the house, it seemed a little more comforting. The light streaming from the windows dispelled the evil image that the house had before. Half an hour later, the place seemed almost home, full of light, warmth, and the smell of thick vegetable soup boiling on the stove. "What's through there?" asked Joanne between sips of her hot sweet tea. "2 bedrooms that double in one and 3 single beds in the other," said Max. "A smashed chair and a load of old boxes. No snakes. None that we've seen." "I can't believe there are none in here," she said in surprise. "Well, there ain't," said Paul firmly. "I believe you. It doesn't sound it." "It's just every abandoned shed I've ever known has had one somewhere," she said doubtfully. "This one hasn't. Leastways, not yet," he added, with a sly grin. The thought prompted Joanne to look up into the rafters. Considering how it looks from outside, the place is pretty well built. Even the spiders haven't got in. The casual observation strangely disturbed them. Until she had spoken, they hadn't thought about the absence of cobwebs, or the thick layer of dust they realized should have coated everything. Paul was looking uneasily around the room. "I thought somebody was going to bring the radio in." "Sorry, I forgot," said Max. "And don't ask, the answer's no." They all avoided Paul's eyes as he scanned the room. Nobody wanted to go out again, especially now that they were at last drying out. "I'll get it," offered Diane, muttering under her breath, "I got most everything else." She reached for her jacket lying beside the door, but it felt too wet and cold to slip into. She opened the door. Outside it was still pouring with rain. For a few moments Diane couldn't see the rover in the darkness. Then the glass of the headlights glinted in the reflected light. It was less than 20 meters away, but each time she had run it, the distance had seemed to double. She dropped the jacket, deciding just to be quick instead, and sprinted through the shallow puddles that overflowed in most spots along the path. Snatching open the door, she decided against climbing in, instead reaching over the seat to grab the black plastic case. Her jeans and the thin cotton shirt covering her back were offered to the downpour, and the material clung to her flesh as the falling drops of moisture discolored the fabric in a spreading smear. Her wet fingers sought for, then gripped the handle. Within seconds, she was splashing back and onto the veranda. Diane reached for the door. It was just then, just as she was about to enter the security of the room containing her friends, that she felt the damp skin on the back of her neck crawl. Still holding the doorknob, she slowly, very slowly turned her head and looked over her shoulder. Diane knew exactly where to look. The yellow glow of the hurricane lamp gave her no cause for doubt. It drew her gaze to where it was hanging, low down in the bushes, or to where she thought that it was hanging, until she saw the shape alongside it. The dark, still shadow of a human figure, watching her. Diane snatched the door open, raced through, and slammed it after her, before leaning back against the timber wall. They all turned, looking in surprise at her abrupt entrance.
We hope you enjoyed the first part of Poison Ground. Just what has Diane seen, and what have rabbits got to do with the story? Join us here at Starship Writer for the conclusion. But for now, thanks for being on the Starship Writer channel. We hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, please like and subscribe so we can let you know when we have more to upload. Thank you for visiting the channel.